All right. So the purpose of this particular session is to address consciousness. So we're going to talk a lot about consciousness today, and I'm recording this. And this is the first time that I've actually done a PowerPoint. But the reason why I've done this PowerPoint is because I have a lot of thoughts on this. I've been doing a lot of research on it for about 3 months now. And that's just barely enough time to scratch the surface. But I do think that we have something to add here to the discussion. I think I can clarify some points. And I think I can also add some elements to the debate about consciousness and what it is. All right, so I'll start with a bit of a preface, a bit of an introduction. Then I'm going to talk briefly about reasons why this is an important topic for a church to address, and the reasons why we should develop an understanding of the concept of consciousness and what its definition is. I will criticize what I think are some of the deficits of the modern study of consciousness and the mind, because I think that's one of the places that I have something to add to this debate and this conversation. I'm going to introduce after that this kind of idea that I have of the soft duality framework for understanding what the brain is, what the mind is, and what the difference is. And then I'm going to talk about what are the requisite components of consciousness, what needs to be present for a conscious mind to arise. And I'm also going to talk about the conscious individual. And I'm going to talk about the environment and what parameters need to exist in that environment for consciousness to emerge. And then lastly, I'm going to briefly touch on this. Is there anything more beyond the brain, the mind, and consciousness? Then we'll have a brief summary. All right, so here's some prefacing notes which are important. So the reason why I wanted to address this is, as a church that is focused on sort of addressing religious questions and spiritual questions from an intellectual perspective, perhaps the most common question that I receive is, do humans have a soul? Do we have a soul? Is there something spiritual to us, or isn't there? And I decided that the best way to first answer this question is by having a more thorough definition of what underlies the conscious mind. And the reason why I wanted to address that is because it may be that the soul is equivalent to consciousness, and we'll talk more about that. It may be that there's something more to the soul than just consciousness, but we'll talk about that as well. But I think understanding what consciousness is kind of a prerequisite for addressing what you want to put on top of that, for example, the soul. Why is it important to reflect upon consciousness? It's such a fundamental, I'm going to briefly talk about this because I think it's obviously so important. It's our lens for all reality. It's woven into our identities and who we are. It's the framework with which we perceive the universe. And without consciousness, you can't even really say that as individuals that we even exist. So it is really important to address the topic of consciousness. And I think there's really a deficit and a sparsity of scientific and philosophical debate about what the conscious mind is. It's certainly something that we're starting to delve into with a greater degree of complexity. But I think right now, there's not as much literature as you would think addressing what the conscious mind is. John Archibald Wheeler said it well. He was the first physicist, one of the most influential and under-recognized physicists of this century. He actually coined the term black holes. He said the universe gives birth to consciousness, and consciousness gives meaning to the universe. Steven Pinker is a Harvard psychologist, and consciousness is certainly a precious gift, and it's how we perceive the universe, and it's very important. So I think it is important to study consciousness. And I think it's also important to study, talk about, and address consciousness more than what we're doing. And I do want to pause right here and say that's one of the purposes actually of Alluvium. That's one of the purposes of our church. It's not to provide answers for questions like, do humans have a soul? No, the purpose is actually to ask those questions and to get other people excited about asking those questions and about talking about those concepts. All right, so here's the problem that I perceive with the debate about consciousness. And this is one of the problems, is that most of the debate that currently exists debates whether or not consciousness is mechanistic, or if there's some sort of epiphenomenon or emergent property of consciousness. For example, on the one side, you have philosophers like Daniel Dennett, who believe that consciousness is purely and in a very reductionistic way something that's mechanistic, something that we will eventually describe and understand very thoroughly. On the other hand, you have people like David Chalmers, who believes that consciousness is an epiphenomenon. You have people like Stewart Hameroff, who's an anesthesiologist, actually, who believes that consciousness is an emergent epiphenomenological process that arises from quantum effects at the microtubular level within neurons. His theory has been largely debunked, and I think that this debate actually does very little to advance the understanding or the definition of consciousness. So what we're going to do is sort of presuppose that this debate has been solved, and we're going to presuppose that there is a structural or at least a mechanistic etiology for consciousness. So I think it's important to start with that, because if you don't start with that assumption, if you say, well, there's something that's sort of almost magical to it, it's really very difficult to have a meaningful debate about what it is. And the more I delved into the research that's currently ongoing about consciousness, the more I realized that if we're going to advance our perspective on what consciousness is, we really have to have the starting point that there is an etiology for consciousness. As we'll see in just a few moments, it's important that we don't treat that etiology as a reductionist interpretation. We shouldn't think of an explanation for consciousness as a way to take anything away from it. So consciousness is still a really interesting and marvelous and awesome phenomenon. So we shouldn't think that once we have an explanation for why consciousness exists, that we've reduced it in any way. Another problem that I see in the modern debate about consciousness is that we talk about individuals in the universe being conscious. But what we don't talk about is the role of the environment in the framework of how consciousness arises. So what I'm saying is that consciousness is really a relationship. It's a relationship between us and between the universe. Most of the science that exists around the study of consciousness just evaluates the brain and just thinks about how are humans conscious. And the problem with that is that we're not also thinking about the environment that we are conscious of. That may seem like a point that's so obvious, but I don't think it is. I think it is a point that has been overlooked. That consciousness is really a relationship between the individual and the environment. And the rules of the environment, like time and causality, are inherently woven into the framework of consciousness. And also, in order to be conscious of an environment, there has to be sort of boundaries between the self and the environment. So we have to be able to perceive ourselves, and we have to be able to sort of make a boundary or a border around ourselves and separate ourselves from the environment in our conscious mind. Another problem with the study of consciousness, and there's probably no way around this one, and this is probably the one that is least problematic, but another problem with the modern study of consciousness is that we always focus only on the human mind. So the human mind is probably one of the most complex frameworks of consciousness, maybe in existence, maybe even in the whole universe. So it would be great if we had a more rudimentary parameter for understanding consciousness that we could use to sort of talk about consciousness in a way that's scientific and intellectual and interesting. Nonetheless, we kind of have to restrict ourselves to a framework for constructing the parameters of consciousness that are at least animalistic. So in other words, we're not going to talk about the consciousness of plants. We're not going to talk about the consciousness of inanimate objects. There's some interesting lectures that I found on those topics, but we're going to kind of skip over that and limit our conversation strictly to what you might call an animalistic consciousness. And the reason why we're doing that is because there's almost no framework for a debate if you try and imagine all subtypes of consciousness. So we'll strictly be speaking about an animalistic type of consciousness. So again, we're going to start with a starting point of thinking that someday we will understand the biological underpinnings of consciousness. We'll understand that with enough time, scientific effort, computational energy, and technological advancement. I think that's just a starting point that we have to take for granted, because otherwise it's nearly impossible to have a meaningful debate about consciousness. And I've come to understand this by just looking at a lot of lectures on consciousness, looking at a lot of debates on consciousness, and also by having a lot of discussions with different people about what consciousness is here at the church. I think it's just impossible to have a meaningful debate if you assume that there's some part of consciousness that's magical or is separate from the known laws of physics. So everything that we're going to say here is going to have a basis or a relationship in the known laws of nature and physics. However, we shouldn't consider that a mechanistic viewpoint of consciousness is reductionistic. And I think this is a message that's lost in the debate. I think if you look at a lot of the debates, even between atheists and people who are more religious about consciousness, is the argument is always presented as, well, we have a mechanism, and therefore it's really a very mechanistic property like an engine running. I don't think we should think of consciousness that way, and we'll see more reasons why. But we shouldn't consider that if we have an etiology, or if we have causality, or if we have a mechanism for how and why consciousness emerges, that means it's somehow reduced or somehow less awesome or less marvelous. And I'll talk about reasons why that is later too. So the original formulation of Cartesian dualism is kind of the way we have resolved this debate just kind of in antiquity. Most people have repudiated the idea of dualism, so we now no longer think that dualism exists. But the historical concept of dualism proposed by René Descartes has largely been abandoned, but what he basically argued is that there is the brain, which is the structure, and then there is the mind, which somehow exists above and beyond the brain. There's certainly a relationship between the two, but the two are separate, and that's the idea of dualism. Most people have abandoned that, and Sean Carroll and Max Tegmark, who are great physicists, have actually addressed this topic a little bit as well. And I think that there's no reason to think that there's anything extra beyond the known laws of physics and chemistry to explain consciousness. So there's probably not a new rule of the universe. There may be, but I think we should start with the assumption that we don't need anything beyond physics and chemistry to understand or explain consciousness. Physics and chemistry are vast fields, of course, so there's a lot of rules and ideas that you can tap into in this, but I don't think we need anything extra that isn't already known or summarized as a law of the universe to explain this. But we do have to look beyond the structure of the brain itself. And this may seem like it's contradictory, but it's really not. The structure of the brain is definitely not enough to explain what consciousness is. And the reason why is because there's a milieu of chemistry and different laws of physics that the brain is sitting in that are inherently woven into its function. When we look at how the brain works and how it functions, when we do functional MRI, what we're really looking at is local oxygenation concentrations. We're looking at blood flow. There's also hormonal milieus and hormonal and neurotransmitter communications in the brain and amongst the neurons and in those interstitial spaces between neurons. And the brain can't be thought of as something that exists as separate from the laws of physiology in order to understand consciousness. You cannot kind of lay the brain down as a structural root of consciousness, but in order to really understand how the brain works and how consciousness emerges, you have to think about the chemical and physiologic properties of the brain and its milieu in terms of the organism. All right, next point. Alpha waves actually prime different parts of the brain to respond differently. So there are different temporal and spatially heterogeneous electrical impulses that comprise how the brain works in terms of its biology. The reason why that's important is because if you actually stimulate an unconscious brain, then you can actually get some electrical impulses to emerge in a certain locality, a certain region of the brain. But it's only when the mind is consciousness, it's only when you do that to a conscious mind that you see a lot of that temporal and spatial heterogeneity of the impulses bouncing around the brain. Another reason why the brain is a part of the organism, and the organism's function in a living state is inherently tied to how the brain works, and the brain is inherently tied to the organism. So we have to think about the organism too. So, and then another reason why I like the soft duality framework is because short-term memory is really based on chemical signaling. It's only long-term memory that's rooted in the structure of the brain, but short-term memory is actually based on neurotransmitter chemistry and communication. So that's another reason why we can't think of just the structure of the brain as sufficient for explaining the brain's function in generating consciousness. But we are starting to think of this as a layered function in my conceptualization, um, where we kind of understand that the brain is the most basal layer of that hierarchy. And then we put those additional rules of physiology, of physics, of chemistry, of neurotransmitter chemistry, of the existence of the animal, of blood flow, and all those sorts of things on top of the framework of the structure of the brain to generate this hierarchy. All right, but I do think that once we talk about the mind and the brain, those conversations have to be sufficient for what we term consciousness. There can't be another component of the equation, and we'll see more reasons why there cannot be other components. But let's start with the assumption that the mind and the brain, so the brain and its structure, and the mind in terms of the physiologic status of the brain as it functions inside an organism, are the two components of what gives rise to consciousness. All right, so now let's turn our attention to a slightly different side of this and talk about what are the components of consciousness. So what does it mean to be consciousness? I don't think that we can understand and advance the understanding of consciousness without having some definitions and without having a more thoroughly vetted and sussed out definition of what consciousness is with a lot of parameters. So let's take as an intellectual exercise this idea that we are going to construct a framework in which we can place a conscious entity within an environment. So imagine that this is sort of a simulation of an environment and of conscious creatures within the environment. And this may seem like a really obvious point, but it will really be apparent immediately why we can't just think of the animals in the environment themselves. We have to also consider the environment. And like I said, we also have to consider that there's consciousness, there's the conscious brain, and also there's the environment in which consciousness exists. So we are going to restrict our focus to an animalistic conception of consciousness just so we can have meaningful definitions that we can relate to. This is sort of analogous in this exercise, as you'll see, of the definition of life in biology. There are sort of a lot of parameters, but we can sort of think of systems that might violate those parameters, but I still think that having these definitions is a really useful starting point. So as I was thinking about this, and I think this hasn't yet been addressed in the literature, I came up with what I think are the 10 elements that comprise a conscious entity. And these are elements of not only the entity itself, but the system, which comprises the individual entity that has consciousness and also the environment. So the components of consciousness are, as I said, one is the environment. So you have to have a set of physical rules. You have to have causality. You have to have space and time. This may seem axiomatic and obvious, but it is really important. And I think when you think of experiments that we've done to generate consciousness within a computer system, one of the problems with those systems is that we don't have a boundaries of what the environment is. We don't have a set of rules and a set of rules for causality. You also, in order to have components of a conscious system, the conscious individual has to be able to draw borders. It has to be able to delineate itself as separate from the environment. Okay, so sort of in addition to that, you have to have a set of senses or a set of inputs for taking in the environment. So that's really critically important to maintain and establish those borders, and also to establish a set of interacting rules for how the conscious individual interacts with the environment. So there has to be some sort of a sensory input for taking in the environment. And then there has to be an ability to respond to the stimuli from the environment. So once you have that sensory input, you have to be able to have a response. Maybe that response is motion. Maybe it's seeking out resources. Maybe it's buttressing the barriers or strengthening the walls between the conscious entity and the environment. But there has to be an ability to respond to stimuli. The next point is that those decisions in terms of how the conscious individual responds to the environment have to be separate from the rules of the environment itself. So there has to be some sort of decision calculus. You can imagine a system that meets some of the definitions that we've stated, but it's not really conscious because It may just be like billiard balls or some sort of entities inside the environment that are just responding to the laws of physics. Now, a criticism to this point might be, and you might think, well, we're just kicking the can down the road because we've said that it has to be separate from the laws of physics, so you have to have a conscious mind, and now we have to come up with definitions for what that conscious mind is. I don't think that's a criticism of this. And the reason why is because we do have algorithmic and mathematical and computational rules that have developed as sort of AI algorithms or decision forests. So there are a lot of different rules and parameters that you could imagine that would exist within the conscious individual that would be related to the rules of the physical rules of the system, but would be separate from those rules. And I think any kind of decision forest or decision tree or AI algorithm that's been come up with would meet that criteria. But there definitely has to be an ability to make decisions or to make choices or respond to the environment in a way that is not simply governed by the laws of physics of the environment itself. Now, here's where we get into like an animalistic sort of idea of consciousness. There has to be an internal assessment of what a positive and negative interaction is. So there has to be an a priori sense of pleasure or pain for a conscious individual to emerge within a system. You have to be able to sort of generate an assessment of this is a good or meaningful interaction, or this is a negative or bad interaction. And so there has to be sort of an assessment qualitatively of stimuli and decisions that you make in response to those stimuli and subsequent actions. So the brain has a pain and pleasure center. Most animals also have at least some sort of pain or pleasure center, and even very basic rudimentary multicellular organisms also have sort of ways that they can generate judgments that internally have some sort of feedback. Now, the next thing is you have to have a memory system. So I think to have any meaningfully animalistic type of consciousness, you have to be able to lay down memories, and then you have to be able to have recall, and you have to be able to come up with narratives of things that have happened in the past. So there has to be a system of memory in order to have any kind of meaningful animalistic sense of consciousness. Interoception refers to the ability of the conscious individual to sense itself internally. So we talked about stimuli related to the environment, but interoception is sort of stimuli that are related to the internal body. So in order to have an animalistic consciousness, there has to be some sort of a stimulus response system that exists internal to the organism or internal to the conscious entity or individual. Proprioception refers to an assessment of how the conscious individual is moving within the environment. So when you move your arm and you kind of have a sense of, okay, I've moved my arm this way, this is how I've changed the environment, this is how I've changed the universe around me. That's sort of what we mean when we talk about proprioception. And lastly, and this is very important, you have to have a predictive system. So the neural network of a conscious entity or conscious organism has to be able to say, these are my memories, this is what I recall, and therefore this is what I predict to have happen in this system. Anil Seth has actually done a really wonderful job of elucidating reasons why having that sort of predictive system is very important in terms of a framework for consciousness, and it may be one of the most important parts of human consciousness. Moreover, our ability to very elegantly and with a lot of details predict the future in terms of what might happen to us is probably one of the things why our subtype of consciousness is much more complex than animal systems. So those are the 10 elements that I think are important to coming up with a system of consciousness. And by system, I mean the rules that govern the individual and the rules that govern the environment. Okay, last topic that we're going to address is there any room left in this discussion for a soul? Can there be something more than consciousness? I don't have a good answer for this. Our answer at Alluvium, in terms of the official answer of whether or not humans have a soul, I think the best approximation of what our answer is not that we have a soul or don't have a soul, but it's important to ask the question of whether or not we have a soul. I think you have to at least have consciousness to have a soul. So I think at least in our hierarchy, you can kind of think of, well, we've laid down the brain, we've talked about the mind, and we've talked about consciousness. And then maybe there's another fourth layer that we're not acknowledging significantly enough that may be the soul. But I think focusing on the debate of consciousness is more is going to be more likely to yield fruitful results. But let's talk a little bit, just briefly, about, is there a soul? Is there something more than consciousness? There are a lot of possible explanations for what a soul is. Maybe it's just an illusion. Maybe it's just something we're telling ourselves to give ourselves more meaning in this world. Or maybe it's something so that instead of thinking about at every moment the very diverse and heterogeneous and very complicated mechanism of how we perceive the world and how we become conscious, that it keeps us tied together as sort of monolithic entities that we can sort of process more easily. Maybe there is a component that's an emergent phenomenon or epiphenomenon. I think we don't know that, and that's hard to answer. I'll say that the things that I have looked for in terms of, for most of my research in this conversation, I've focused strictly on consciousness, but I have delved into lectures and other theories that describe why a soul may be separate from or above consciousness. I have not found anything that's sort of satisfying that addresses a soul as an emergent phenomenon. Stewart Hameroff is a very interesting anesthesiologist with some interesting ideas about this Bing moment. He's got some interesting ideas, but I don't particularly like his explanation. I think it's not very scientific. I think it's an interesting narrative, and I'll defer you to some of his resources. But he does sort of think of consciousness as this separate being, and maybe that's a possible explanation. Maybe there's something else to it. I think certainly the arguments of physicists like Sean Carroll and Max Tegmark would argue that there shouldn't be anything else beyond the laws of physics, but maybe there's something else that we're just not acknowledging yet. Maybe there's something divine to it. What I don't like about that acknowledgement is, again, I think a lot of the debate between people who debate the mechanistic from the divine, or people who have debates between atheistic and religious people, sort of treat a mechanistic explanation as a counter argument for the divine. And I don't think there's any reason why you need to do that. I don't think there's any reason why we should think that the fact that we have an explanation for something to occur means that there's not something divine there. So I don't like treating the idea of divine as magical or something separate. I think you can have a more meaningful debate by just assuming that there is something mechanistic or causative or something that's an etiology for something. And that doesn't reduce it. That doesn't mean that it's not something really magical and wonderful, magical in some regards, and wonderful and really awesome. And then another idea for what a soul is maybe it's just sort of a feedback mechanism that when the mind reflects upon itself, it's the conceptualization of ourselves that we feel like we have to land on, at least for some of us. All right, so here's a summary. I think if you take away anything from this conversation, you should take away the point that you shouldn't think of the mechanistic view of the mind as an attempt to reduce in any way human consciousness. If you take a child and you tell them, this is the scope of the universe, this is the extent of the universe, this is what the universe is, and that there are these supernovae that allow us to track how far away galaxies are, and those same supernovae that give us a map of the cosmos are the same things that create all the heavy elements in their bodies and create the basis of their physiology and how they can come to exist. I think that's really awesome and amazing. And I think when we someday fully understand consciousness and we fully understand the mechanism or the etiology of consciousness, we shouldn't view that as an event that will be reductionist in any way. I think we should view that as something that's going to give more insight into how awesome and how amazing the human mind is. So I don't think that we should treat a mechanistic view as a reductionist view. And I think that's where I take issue with people like Daniel Dennett and other people who sort of say there's nothing to consciousness, we'll figure it out one day, and then we'll be able to write an equation for it in a book, and then we'll be done with it. I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think there will be, even when we decide what the mechanism of consciousness is, I think even after that point, there will still be room for debate. There will still be room for research. There'll be room for further understanding of what the implications of that are. And I think there will also be room for us understanding who we are and our role in terms of the universe in an interesting philosophical way, because we will now have a mechanism for understanding how we came to be conscious. So I think understanding the mechanism of consciousness shouldn't be interpreted as reductionistic, and it also shouldn't be interpreted as the endpoint of the narrative of the story of the science of consciousness. All right, so thanks very much for paying attention. Thanks very much for tuning into this lecture. And I hope very much so that if you've taken away nothing else from this debate, that you're excited about asking the question about what is consciousness and what does that mean in terms of whether or not we have a soul, or what does it mean in terms of what it means to be human and how it means that we relate to the universe. But I'm super grateful that you've tuned into this conversation. Thank you.